London, in early September 1666, smelled of sawdust, river mud, and old smoke. The city had been drying out for months under an unusually hot summer. Timber-framed houses leaned over narrow lanes barely wide enough for a cart. Thatch still covered rooftops in poorer districts despite laws against it. The streets near the river were packed tight, with warehouses full of tallow, pitch, and oil. Nobody at the time thought of London as a city waiting to burn. But the conditions had been building quietly for years, not weeks. The summer of 1666 had produced almost no rain across southern England. Timber beams in the older buildings had dried out to near kindling density. The Thames was low. The winds in early September were coming from the northeast. On the night of Saturday, the 1st of September, most of London was asleep. Thomas Farriner was a baker who supplied the Navy with ship's biscuits. His bakehouse stood on Pudding Lane, a short street running down toward the river. Exactly how the fire started inside his bakehouse is still not settled by historians. The most accepted account is that an oven was left insufficiently damped down. By around 1 or 2 in the morning, the ground floor of his house was burning. Farriner, his family, and a servant escaped by climbing out through an upstairs window. A maidservant reportedly could not bring herself to climb out and died there. That single death on Pudding Lane would become one of the few recorded at the fire's start. By 2 in the morning, the blaze had caught the hay and fodder of a nearby inn. The wind picked it up immediately and pushed embers east along the lane. The fire moved faster than a person expecting it to stop. A neighbor named Hanson or Hammond, records vary on the name, raised the alarm. The Lord Mayor of London was woken sometime around 3 in the morning. Sir Thomas Bloodworth looked at the fire and, according to Samuel Pepys, dismissed it. The phrase most often repeated is that a woman could piss it out. Whether he said those exact words is uncertain, but his inaction that night is not. He did not order the creation of firebreaks, which meant pulling down houses in the fire's path. That decision, or the failure to make it, would cost the city enormously. By dawn on Sunday, the 2nd of September, the fire had crossed into Thames Street. Thames Street was exactly the wrong place for a fire of this speed. It ran parallel to the river and was lined with warehouses holding oil, rope, brandy, and coal. The fire didn't just spread here, it accelerated. Burning pitch and tallow ran through the street and into the lanes on either side. People were still trying to move furniture and goods out of their houses, not flee. The psychology of early fire response in the 17th century was retrieval, not escape. Men hired porters. Women bundled linens. Carts were loaded with plate and chests. This slowed everything and clogged the lanes that firefighters needed to move through. By mid-morning Sunday, the fire had reached the waterfront itself. Wharves caught, boats on the river began to fill with people and their possessions. Samuel Pepys watched from the river by boat and described burning pigeons falling from the air. He had gone to Whitehall that morning to report directly to King Charles II. The king ordered demolitions to begin, but passing that order down the chain took time. The Lord Mayor, overwhelmed, reportedly told Pepys he had been pulling down houses all night. The evidence suggests otherwise. Very few demolitions had actually happened by midday Sunday. The fire was already jumping gaps that should have slowed it. Embers carried on, the northeast wind landed on rooftops 2 or 3 streets ahead. This is the mechanism that made the Great Fire so difficult to contain by hand. It wasn't a single wall of flame moving steadily forward. It threw sparks ahead of itself, starting secondary fires before the main body arrived. By Sunday afternoon, the fire had consumed most of the area between the river and Cannon Street. The smoke column was visible from villages more than 20 miles outside the city. Thousands of people were now moving north and west, away from the advancing heat. The roads out of the city were thick with carts, animals, and people carrying bundles. The parishes of St. Lawrence Pountney and St. Mary Abchurch were already gone by evening. These weren't empty buildings. They were the accumulated architecture of several centuries. Medieval churches, guild halls, merchant houses, livery company premises, all burning together. The heat by Sunday night was intense enough to be felt across the river in Southwark. Pepys buried his wine and his Parmesan cheese in his garden to save them from the fire. That detail sounds almost comic, but it tells you something real about what people valued and feared. By Monday morning, the 3rd of September, the fire had found its most consequential target. St. Paul's Cathedral stood on Ludgate Hill, the highest ground in the old city. It was undergoing repairs at the time and had scaffolding around parts of its exterior. Booksellers had stored enormous quantities of paper and printed stock in the cathedral's stone vaults. They believed the thick stone walls would protect everything inside. They were wrong. The scaffolding caught first, then the lead roof began to melt under the sustained heat. Molten lead poured down Ludgate Hill in streams, according to John Evelyn, who watched from nearby. The stone itself cracked and exploded under thermal stress. The booksellers lost virtually their entire stock. The cathedral was gutted completely. By Tuesday, the 4th of September, the fire had been burning for nearly 60 hours. It had moved west toward the legal district of the Temple and north toward Cripplegate. King Charles himself rode out into the streets on Monday and Tuesday to direct firefighting efforts. He passed out coins to men working the hand-pumped fire engines and forming bucket chains. Whether this was leadership or theater is a question historians answer differently depending on their sympathies. What it did do was keep some of the firefighting organized when organization was collapsing. The fire engines of 1666 were small, slow, and required a constant supply of water. The city's wooden water pipes had burned away in many areas, cutting off supply entirely. Bucket chains from the river were the primary method for much of the effort. It was exhausting, dangerous, and largely insufficient against a fire of this scale and speed. The real turning point came not from engines or buckets, but from gunpowder. On Tuesday, the Navy began using controlled explosions to bring down houses ahead of the fire. This created gaps wide enough that the wind-driven embers had less to land on. The northeast wind also began to ease on Tuesday, which mattered enormously. Without the wind, the fire lost its primary mechanism for jumping ahead of containment. By Wednesday morning, the 5th of September, the main fire was effectively stopped. Some areas smoldered for days, cellars burned for weeks in certain spots, but the advancing front had been halted somewhere near the Church of St. Giles, without Cripplegate. The final accounting took time to assemble, and historians still debate the precise numbers. Somewhere around 13,000 houses had been destroyed across roughly 400 acres. 87 churches were gone, including St. Paul's, along with the Royal Exchange and the Guildhall. The number of confirmed deaths was strikingly small, perhaps in the single digits officially recorded. This puzzles people, and it should, because the destruction was genuinely enormous. The low death toll likely reflects the fire's relatively slow overnight start, and the days it took to spread. People had time to leave even if they lost everything in doing so. Tens of thousands were now living in makeshift camps in Moorfields and Islington to the north. They had furniture sometimes, and whatever they could carry. Many had almost nothing. The autumn of 1666 was approaching, and these people had no houses to return to. The city smelled of ash and hot stone for weeks. The ground was still warm underfoot. Blame arrived quickly, as it usually does after catastrophe. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the fire deliberately and was hanged. Most contemporaries appear to have doubted his confession even at the time. He arrived in England after the fire had already started, which made the whole story impossible. The confession was likely coerced or fabricated, but the execution went ahead regardless. Parliament investigated and concluded the fire was an act of God rather than deliberate arson. Londoners were not entirely satisfied with that answer, and some never would be. A monument was later erected near the site on Pudding Lane, as it still stands today. Christopher Wren was given the commission to rebuild St. Paul's and dozens of parish churches. The new city that emerged over the following decades used more brick and stone than before. Wider streets were introduced in some areas, though the grand replanning schemes were never fully realized. Property disputes, legal complications, and the sheer cost of rebuilding slowed everything considerably. London did rebuild, but it did so piecemeal, neighborhood by neighborhood, over many years. As with most events of this scale, the details depend significantly on which sources you follow. Pepys, Evelyn, and official records sometimes disagree on timing, sequence, and the scale of specific losses. What is not in dispute is the shape of what happened across those 4 days in September: a bakehouse fire on a dry lane, a wind from the northeast, and a city built from timber. The conditions had been accumulating quietly. The spark, when it came, found everything ready.